find community together in this moment through doing some sort of education pieces. And so we're sort of the guinea pig, and this is the trial run. But first, before we get into this, I just wanted to sort of say like a little about how we're kind of experiencing this time here in Hood River. And it's just sort of this, I guess what we're feeling is this dissonance between how beautiful it is, like in this place where we're at, and in terms of our experience with nature, and then how sort of challenging the current sort of social and economic situation is with the virus. And that dissonance impacts us like in so many ways. And I think like the constancy and like the rhythmic beauty of the natural world gives us this opportunity to sort of seek solace in it and kind of can provide comfort. At the same time, it also sort of makes us realize that like how precious this is, and that I think throughout most of history, like nature has been this kind of constant. It's been this thing that's always here. And in this huge moment of crisis, I think it's just reminding us that maybe the natural world won't always be like that for us if we don't do sort of what we can to sort of nurture it and to reconnect with it. And so I guess that's how I'm mostly feeling this moment right now, is I'm thankful that we have all this, but also really conscious of the need to find ways to interact with the natural world, and not just as like big nature, but in like really specific ways, just to get grounded, just so that it will continue to be here for us kind of as we need it. Enough of that. And sort of kind of drop back into the education sort of part of it. So I'm Nate, and I have Hiyu Wine Farm, where I sort of farm and make wine in Hood River, which is down the valley in that direction. So we're in the upper valley, which is much colder. We're at 2,100 feet at Mount Hood Organic Farm, which has been a biodynamic farm for 20 years, an organic farm for more than 40. It was one of the first organic farms in the Pacific Northwest. And we started a collaboration with John, Brady, and Molly, who farm here, in 2014 to make cider just from this site. And we call the cider Floreal. And that project was inspired by many like different things. One, it was inspired by my mentor, Maggie Harrison, who is at Antigua Terra, who said, in coming to live in this like historic like Orchard River Valley, that we needed to interact with the history of that, and that the only way to do that was to make wine from the fruit that was grown here traditionally, which is apples. The other part of it was based around the valley itself and seeing this place with sort of incredible like fertility and potential to grow things, but where the commerce surrounding the conventional fruit growing industry was sort of eroding and destroying a lot of that potential from like an ecological perspective. And so we wanted to ask ourselves, like, how could we interact with the farmers in the valley here to show a path where their lives were richer, where they could be economically more supported, and do that in a way that cared for the land on sort of a deeper level. And so we set up this collaborative project with this orchard, where basically they do the farming and we make the cider. We split the rest of the cost, but then we share all the profits 50-50. And the idea behind this was that instead of buying people's apples that they couldn't sell and paying sort of cut rate prices for that, that we would, and then kind of taking all those profits for ourselves, that instead we wanted something where the farmers were able to sort of share equally in the profits as sort of the producer, and that if we could build up a successful model on this farm based on that, then we could sort of chart a path forward for other farmers in the valley being able to diversify what they were doing with their orchards, and ultimately hopefully leading to a path where the Hood River Valley could become all organic, where more land could be given back to nature, and sort of all those things. So like that's the context like that all this is happening in. I have the person behind the camera right now is Brian McClintock. I'm talking too much.
We are actually social distancing. It's an optical illusion. I'm 700 yards away from you right now.
And so he's gonna ask me some like questions and sort of hope like lead us into, or maybe he's not.
Dude, you don't need any prompting.
But lead us like on this path towards sort of sharing what we find compelling about the cider experience. First, I wanted to share. Trying to trust him, who's my partner in Hiyu, made some visual cues that I'm supposed to show. Yeah. And so this is a map that shows like where we are right now. And so the Columbia River is here, and then Hiyu Wine Farm's here, and the Columbia is at sea level. And this is Mount Hood. That's a little over 11,000 feet. And so right now, we're right here, right at the base of the mountain at 2,100 feet. And basically surrounded by national forest. And this is the first farm where the water off the mountain comes into the valley. And so there's actually a mile of riverfront as part of this property. And all the water that's used here comes directly from the mountain, has never seen another farm first. So one of the questions that Brian had asked me was sort of about how do the fermentations go here? And my answer was that the fermentations here are amazing, and they're amazing because of this place. And so from the beginning, it's been astonishing that the ciders are made completely without sulfur at any point in the process, and we've never had a single problem. And so the cider, the apples, they're milled, macerated, layered with straw in a really traditional way in a vertical basket press, pressed directly into barrel, and then they just sit there. We don't top them. They just kind of do their thing for a year, and then we use re-fermenting juice from the next vintage to restart the cider, and they're entirely problem-free, and I mostly attribute that to this place. So one is how amazing the farming's been for 40 years, but then also the proximity to the mountain, the elevation, the natural environment around us, I think just brings us fruit that it needs nothing.
Do you, if we drill that down, do you think that's like a wealth of microbial life that wouldn't ordinarily exist, literally aiding that fermentation in a more profound way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, if you came, like right now we're in the middle of winter, and so everything that's kind of on the ground hasn't started to grow yet, but if you come here during the summer, this orchard is awash with life. Like there's so many different kind of plants, but different kind of animals, so many birds and insects kind of growing. We're not the kind of people to like sort of isolate what that factor is, and I think it's more of just a bunch of things working together that lead to that. But yeah, I think that there is just a level of sort of health and harmony here that doesn't exist on your average farm, both because of the raw location itself in this wilderness area, but also because of how the Jacobsons have cared for the property over time.
You can hear the birds. Everybody's commenting about the birds, man.
Oh, amazing! Yeah. And when we walked up here, there were wild turkeys as we were coming up.
Yeah.
It's quite something.
You're talking to me a little bit about the soil here too.
Yeah. So it's so again, you're right up the mountain. So it's volcanic sand, but what's interesting is it's composed of between 20 to 40% volcanic glass shards, and so there's sort of this extraordinary like reflectivity. And so you're in this place where you have this incredible light because there's not that much UV that's kind of, because the mountain's thin in the atmosphere. So you're in this place where you have this incredible mountain light, but then you have this soil that sort of reflects it in this mirror-like way that's very, very special.
Nice. All right.
Do you want to talk about I'm going to use one of my props again.
Let's do it. That's what they're there for.
So one of the things we've been working on is sort of increasing diversity here. And so these are some of the apples that we work with for the cider. So Ashmead's Kernel, Golden Russet, Wixon Crabapple, Quince, Medal d'Or, Redfield. What we've been focusing on is making a cider that is more like wine, that has more intensity, so more amplitude, so has more sugar, more acid, more tannin than a typical cider. And so I like to do this like little triangle. And so normally cider's built more like beer. And so you have this small triangle, and like the size of the triangle is sort of related to the amount of alcohol. In this case, about like 5%. And so you have a balance of smaller amounts of tannin, acidity, and sugar. What we're trying to do is create a really big triangle that has high acidity, high sugar, high tannin, resulting in a cider that achieves balance at around 10 to 11% alcohol, which is the same as wine. The site's really special in that it helps us attain it, but we've planted like 80 different varieties, all geared towards making that kind of cider. And so we see sugars, so we planted apples that would allow us to have sugars around 18 to 20 bricks, acids that are more like Mosel Riesling, so TAs around between 10 to 14. And then tried to find quince and bitter sharp apples with those same qualities that would also kind of bring those levels. I'm dropping that.
How did you go about data mining which varieties to plant at the outset?
That's tough. I mean, that's tough, and a lot of it is like trial and error. But we looked at just kind of old records of when people have sort of said, like, this is a super high potential sugar producing apple, or this has a lot of acidity. And while it's true that apples behave in a totally different way depending on where they're planted, we tried to pick the apples that had the most potential for that. And basically we tried to avoid the bitter sweets. And so when we use the term bittersweet, what we're really talking about is an apple that has a lot of tannin, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of sugar and acidity. And so when we were focusing on apples, we focused primarily on crab apples, which have like supernatural levels of acidity, sugar, and tannin. But then we focused on the bitter sharps, often like the vintage ones. So things like Kingston Black, Porter's Perfection, Medal d'Or, apples that could be balanced like on their own. And I was just going and say, do you want to talk a little bit about the other thing that we're really excited about, and part of like making this like big triangle of like amplitude, intensity, and making ciders that are more like wine, is that we're really trying to like kind of break down the barrier, the wall between people's perceptions of what is cider, what is wine. And we're really trying to get to the point where we see them all as fruit wines, and we really don't see like a difference between in quality or in profundity or in ways that they can be used in food, like between these different beverages. And so one of the things we're really trying to move towards here, and especially in terms of biodiversity, is eventually having mixed fields that are planted to apples, berries, grapes, different herbs, and then making wines that are almost like perpetual ferments of all these things mixed together. And so one of the first steps is sort of trying to do things that allow people to see that wine made from different fruits can be experienced kind of on the same level sort of as wine. And so this is sort of our first like experimental step in that process, is sort of developing a cider that can challenge like those perceptions. And that's one of the things that we're sort of up to.
So are there other fruit trees planted here?
Yeah, so right now there's pear and quince, and there's always pear and quince in the cider. And then we've begun to do sort of the first experimental portion of like different berries. And then there's definitely like significant cross-pollination between here and Hiyu. And so at Hiyu, we're working on developing small forest gardens where there are grapes growing up trees, berries planted in the understory, and where it can all be harvested together to sort of make a product. Then hopefully those two projects will begin to merge, and we'll begin to do some of that experimentation here as well.
There's a lot of cherries here in the gorge. Do you see that entering into
Totally. No, and so part of it is like there's this real beauty in terms of like at what times a year fruit's ripening. And so you can start with things, you know, in essence, like start with like rhubarb and then move to strawberry, and then cherries and different plums and peaches, and then pears and apples and grapes. And so I think cherries are really important. One, in that they have like really high sugar potential. Two, they're incredibly delicious. But three, they like, if you were trying to like have these kind of ferments going throughout the year, it would just give you this another opportunity to make an infusion or to make a cider or something like that.
And any other things that you see?
Just I think that the herbs and the animals are super important, like in that integration. But also like you know, Fruit Stereo, which is this crazy project in Scandinavia, they're also doing a lot of like vegetable ferments as part of it, using ginger, using beets, using carrots, and that's an amazing way too to like integrate more life and like different things. I feel like we should taste some wine.
Yeah.
So we brought three things. So the first one is Floreal 3, which is in bottle, which is
We need a label shot of that. Just
for sale in New York right now.
Hold on. There we go.
And the cider is, you know, completely wildly fermented, all from the trees here. There's no fruit from anywhere else. Apple, pear, and quince, milled, macerated, layered with straw in a basket press, a year in barrel, and then re-fermented, fermenting juice instead of adding sugar or yeast. And so it's not a pet nat, it's not bottled at the first fermentation, but it's a second fermentation that's basically started with...
See, you frosted the glasses nicely. That is the pro move, my friend. How cold is it out here?
It's freezing.
Yeah, I woke up today, it was 33 degrees, so it can't be much more here.
And so we've actually never tasted this here in the orchard. It's been a long time. I'm gonna turn this around.
Why are you gonna turn this around?
I feel like you should do it. I feel like you should tell me what you're tasting.
Tasting deliciousness. I mean, the cider's unreal. It's been unreal since I've tried it. I had the 3 actually the other day. And it's just amazing, dude. I mean, I like the range of flavors, but also super clean and also ripe. That's something you often, yeah.
Oh man, this is so good.
It's really good. And so, when I start to think about, you know, moving in a direction of cider, I start to wonder, how will these things age? How complex will it get? Are we in the early stages where people were drinking, DRC for $20-$30 in the 60s? Will this one day be?
Yeah, no, and one of the craziest things that I've noticed is that the cider's actually more resilient than the wines. And so in the barrels, they don't need to be topped. It shows less oxidation. There's sort of a power and an intensity and a wildness that is harder to capture with grapes.
Yeah. It's bone dry, but it's still super generous. It's not underripe.
Yeah.
Doesn't have any weird flavors.
It's incredibly herbal, salty this morning.
Super.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it wants to be here for good reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we also brought.
Be off camera.
I'm trying to surprise Brian because we also brought some 19s, or they're 18s that we re-fermented with 19. So new ciders that are just beginning their fermentation. And this is Nivos, which it's intended to be aged longer on tirage and then disgorged. And this is made from a more intense selection of apples. And so it's based on Wicks and crab apple, but it's also fermented with about 14 different Perry pears, and then many different bitter sharps. And so it has a more linear profile, more acidity, more top end complexity. And it represents kind of where we're going, like with the orchard here. And so this, won't be released for like 5 years, but we have the 14, which Brian and I have tried recently, that has been on tirage and is being disgorged soon. That'll be released hopefully sometime this summer.
Yeah, this is way more brooding. Amazing.
Whoa.
Yeah, there's just like...
No, to me this
is the hard part about
like a
instrument life.
Merceau,
Yeah.
like kind of like
100%, yeah.
note on the wine, like this sort of
like beautiful soft reduction.
Yeah.
So what is the alcohol here? Wow, this is insane.
Yeah, it's about 11%.
Mm-hmm.
And this has probably 10 grams of sugar, even though it tastes bone dry. So there's probably 13 grams of acid.
Jesus.
On this, and so it's just massively intense and concentrated, but still like super pretty and high pitched. And this is also different than it's fermented and aged in 1,000-liter kind of oval casks from Austria.
Right.
And so just sort of a small area where we can just try to focus on this kind of like apex like kind of cider experience. But definitely needs the time. It's super wound up and powerful. And
100. So for those who maybe just like graduating into the cider world, is it a similar fermentation to wine where there's like a primary fermentation and malolactic fermentation, or?
Yeah, like, so we don't actually send a lot of things into labs. And so I don't know if the secondary finishes, but I assume that it does, because it does for all the wines. Possible that it's partial. I've actually never checked. But yeah, it's like a long primary fermentation that lasts, they're slower than for the wine. So 6 to 8 months primary, usually is clear by the second winter. And then what's different for us is just that secondary fermentation in bottle. And so basically when the next vintage's cider has fallen down to about 5 bricks, or it has about 50 grams of sugar per liter in it, we use that, and that's when the yeast populations are kind of highest in the fermenting cider. We use that to restart the fermentation in bottle. And so we end up adding 25% of the new vintage. And so you have this contrast between sort of the fresh new cider and this cider that's been in barrel for a year. But then the secondary fermentation sort of makes them one, and creates like additional levels of complexity. And so I think like that's a super exciting area, is more fermentations. And as we talk about this sort of perpetual fermentation mixed fruit wine, that's again one of the things I'm excited about is, and something I talked a lot with Emmanuel Lassen about actually in Champagne is like how to progressive fermentations adds complexity. So not just a first or second fermentation, but what is it like to ferment something a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth time? And so that's something that we're playing with in addition to Solera as
Right.
cider as well.
That could be crazy.
How are we in time?
I don't know.
I have no idea. We are going to keep track of it. We're going to get in so much trouble.
Your iPhone 1 doesn't have a clock on it.
All right. I think we're gonna cut it at that. I think it was good.
Yeah.
Everyone, thanks for joining us, and we wish everyone just health. And
Do we open up the third bottle? Or are we going to leave that?
we're gonna leave that. We'll drink it ourselves.
Oh, shit.
All right.
Cliffhanger to be continued.
Yeah.